All right, class. Welcome to Nutrition for Sport and Exercise. This is a pretty interesting and pretty long chapter. Unfortunately, I have shortened what we're going to cover in class just a little bit because we have so many other things to focus on. But I know this is a pretty interesting subject for many of you, so I do encourage you to read more about it on your own. And also, if you're interested in it, you can take more nutrition classes where we will have time to cover this in more detail. And on top of that, they're even thinking of creating a sports nutrition minor. So how cool is that? Okay, so we'll dive right into this lecture. Benefits of fitness. If you are active yourself, some of these may seem very obvious. Fitness can improve balance, reduce your risk of falling, improve your immune system, give you healthier body composition, improve digestion in your GI tract, improving sleep, slow down aging, etc. And increasing our fitness is one of the goals for Healthy People 2020. So we want to reduce the number of adults who are sedentary and don't participate in physical activity. Physical activity versus exercise are a little bit different. Anything that is movement and requires energy is considered physical activity. So this could include exercise, sports, or just unplanned activities like, walking around your house or walking to class. Exercise is planned activity. So that's maybe you going to work out or going to practice for running or for basketball. Whichever one you do, there are benefits of both exercise and being physically active. So, goals, I did mention that more and more people need to be exercising or being physically active. I shouldn't say exercise because exercise is planned. You don't have to actually plan your physical activity to get the benefits. You can just be physically active. For example, around the Cal Poly campus, I usually end up walking about 2 miles a day just between classes in my office. And that's considered physical activity because I haven't planned it as a workout, but I do get benefits from this. You'll notice, number one, I crossed out adults and put everybody. These guidelines are made for adults. However, adults are not the only ones who can benefit from physical activity. The very minimum that adults and everyone should do is 150 minutes a week, which is kind of funny. It comes up to about 30 minutes 5 days a week. And that is moderate aerobic activity. So 30 minutes 5 days a week is the very minimum you should do of moderate activity. If you're doing more vigorous activity such as running, perhaps you could do less, but this is a minimum. In addition to aerobic activity, you should also perform strength training activities. For the most benefit, adults should actually perform 300 minutes a week of activity in order to manage their weight, but you do receive some health benefits at 150. And unfortunately, recent studies have shown that over 80% of adults fail to achieve these goals. So we're doing pretty bad with this overall. We're a very sedentary society and we need to move more. Okay, so there are many components of fitness that go into an exercise program or a fitness program, and I'm not going to talk about them very much here. You can read more about them in our book, and you can also read how we quantitate the exertion level or the intensity of your activity in your book. So like I said, I'm not going to talk about that very much here, but there's many different ways that we can quantitate this. Time spent exercising. So like I said, it should be 30 minutes or more. 30 minutes is the minimum, and it should be continuous. As we're going to learn later, The fuel that we burn for energy changes with how long we exercise. And so by working out in at least 10-minute intervals, that can help maximize some of the benefits, and should lower the risk of cardiovascular disease, cancer, diabetes, etc. So the total time is 150 minutes for health benefits. So that is a number to remember. I've actually listened to some really interesting researchers talk about this 150 number, and according to many researchers, it's not enough. I think we know it's not enough, and they recommend more like 300 to actually maintain weight and prevent weight gain. But for the purposes of this class, I really want you to be familiar with 150-minute recommendation. What should that fitness and physical activity look like? So you should be doing this most of the days of the week. And physical activity here is seen on the bottom of this pyramid. And remember, physical activity is things that are unplanned, like playing with your baby or walking the dog or doing errands or raking the leaves. And then exercise is activities that are planned. So we have exercise here in the middle. We have aerobic, flexibility, and strength exercises. All three of these will improve your health in different ways and contribute to different health functions. Then above, we have recreational activities. And at the very top, we have do sparingly. And so those are pretty much sedentary activities. What's important in an exercise plan is that it's variable, meaning you change up the activities that you do. You don't only do one activity day after day after day. And the other important factor is that you are doing something every day or most days of the week. So these are some questions about a successful fitness program. Should it be consistent? That means you should continue doing it, time after time again. You should stick with it. Should it be progressive? That means that you are going to build on it. So for example, if one day you walk a mile, maybe you're going to walk a mile for a whole week, and then maybe the next week you're going to try walking a mile and a half. Or with weightlifting, when you first start going to the gym, maybe you're going to lift 20 pounds, and then as you continue to go, maybe you're going to lift 30 or 40 pounds. Variety, I just talked about, and achievable and maintainable. Can it fit into your lifestyle and schedule? Is it affordable? And so what do you think would be important to a successful fitness program? Hopefully you said all of the above. Okay, how do we fuel our body to do this physical activity and to, conduct exercise or participate in exercise? We do so via our friend ATP. And so remember that ATP is like the body's currency for energy, and we can convert foods we eat into ATP. When we're talking about movement and activity, we have three different pathways or three different energy systems that we use to fuel our activity. And those three different pathways can provide immediate energy, short-term energy, or long-term energy, depending on which one is dominant. In this picture right here, you can see fatty acids, amino acids, glycogen, and blood glucose being used to convert ADP to ATP. You can also see that something called phosphocreatine is being used to convert ADP to ATP. The reason we have these additional energy systems is because the actual amount of ATP stored in the muscle is very, very small. And if we just relied on ATP alone, we would only have about 1 to 2 seconds worth of activity. And so we're constantly having to regenerate ATP so that we can extend muscle contraction over time. And phosphocreatine is one molecule that helps us do that. And then the fatty acids, amino acids, glycogen, and blood glucose also are participating. Okay, so first energy system that I'm going to talk about is the phosphocreatine system. And this system can be activated instantly. However, there is not much energy made or stored. So the duration of the energy you produce from this system is very short, about 5 to 10 seconds. This system will be activated under anaerobic conditions, and it is a very efficient system for quick movements like jumping or fast weightlifting or the beginning of a sprint. And that being said, it is the predominant energy system for very high intensity exercise, so like powerlifting, like I just mentioned. And here in this diagram, oh, I think something might fly in. Yeah, there we go. So here in this diagram, you can kind of see what's happening, but you have CP, which is creatine phosphate, and so that is a creatine molecule with a phosphate molecule. And the phosphate part of that creatine molecule can combine with ADP to make ATP. There is no oxygen used, so that can be beneficial. And this happens very rapidly. So this cycle kicks in as soon as we use up that ATP that is stored in muscle. And remember, we only have about 1 to 2 seconds worth of that ATP. One negative thing about phosphocreatine is it increases intracellular water in muscle cells. And so this actually can lead to water weight gain. And so that's something that athletes need to consider. Creatine concentration can be increased with supplementation. However, some people don't respond to supplementation. And supplementation can help people increase their training intensity, but doesn't generally help with performance. So if they increase their training, they can indirectly increase their performance later, but taking it, right before an event wouldn't necessarily help. Okay, so this is just a diagram of looking at creatine phosphate and ATP and how quickly it is decreased. So ATP is decreased very, very quickly. This is an example of a 100-meter sprint, and so ATP is decreased very quickly. Creatine phosphate is also decreased pretty quickly. Creatine phosphate will kick in right after ATP has been deplaced, but in about 60 seconds, your entire store of creatine phosphate is reduced and depleted, and so you will run out of this energy from this pathway. In order to replenish creatine phosphate, it takes about 4 minutes of rest to replenish half of it, and 7 minutes of rest to replenish 95% of it. So if you're doing activity that requires you to do multiple movements simultaneously and not get any rest in between them, you're going to very quickly deplete your creatine stores and not be able to replenish them quick enough. But if you're doing something where you're able to rest in between moments of activity, you can replace much of your creatine stores if you give it enough time. Okay, what about the foods that we eat? How do we use them for energy? So this should look pretty familiar because we've talked about it in metabolism, but this is showing proteins, carbs, and dietary fats and the different pathways that they follow in our body to be converted to energy. And remember, energy is ATP. So all three nutrients can be used, but glucose and fatty acids are the primary sources. As hopefully you remember, we like to save our proteins for muscle synthesis, cell repair, etc. So what is our body's preferred fuel? It is carbohydrates. So yes, it is carbohydrates. Glucose is preferred by the cells when it is readily available from the bloodstream, because cells like to use glucose. So the second pathway to generate energy when we are being active is anaerobic glycolysis. So this is the name for the second pathway. The first one was the creatine phosphate pathway, and anaerobic glycolysis is the second pathway. And remember, the first pathway was active under conditions of oxygen. Anaerobic means that this glycolysis is happening when we do not have adequate oxygen. And so when oxygen is low, because we're being so physically active, the physical activity level is intense, what's going to happen is we're going to break down glucose and convert it into lactate. So hopefully you remember when we discussed the Cori cycle in metabolism. This process is not very efficient, and only about 5% of the total amount of ATP that could be used from glucose is available when we convert glucose to lactate. However, we can use this under anaerobic conditions, and this is very fast pathway. So next to the creatine phosphate pathway, this is a pretty fast pathway. And so this can help for events where you need a quick burst of energy. Disadvantages of this are that it cannot be sustained for long periods. So here you see that it will only last for 30 to 120 seconds, so max about 2 minutes. And as lactic acid accumulates, it can increase the acidity of the muscle. And that can be a problem. So yeah, the increased acidity level will inhibit the activities of key enzymes in the muscle cells, and this can slow down anaerobic ATP production and cause short-term fatigue. Metabolism of macronutrients, so aerobic pathway. So this would be the third pathway to supply energy. So we had creatine phosphate, we had anaerobic, and now we have aerobic pathway. And so this is the third pathway. And as you can see, this pathway will provide fuel for a much longer time, up to 3 hours. The downside of this pathway is it provides that fuel pretty slowly so that ATP is not released that quickly. And so this pathway is only really helpful for low intensity physical activity, or even sometimes moderate intensity physical activity. Good things about this pathway, it is very efficient, so you're making a lot of ATP, and this can fuel you for a much longer amount of time. Examples of activities where you would probably be utilizing this pathway might be jogging or distance swimming. Glycogen. So remember that we have glycogen stored in our liver and muscles, and glycogen is a very, very long glucose polymer with many, many glucose chains. And so we can break down glycogen to individual glucose units. What does the glycogen in the liver versus the muscles do? Liver glycogen helps maintain blood glucose. So if our blood glucose is low, we will break down liver glycogen so that glucose is released to the bloodstream to bring that glucose back up. Muscle glycogen supports the muscles. That makes a lot of sense, right? If the muscle glycogen is low, then blood glucose can be used to support the muscles, but that's not preferred. Hitting the wall, or sometimes known as bonking. This is a phenomenon that happens to athletes when they have used up all their glycogen stores and they're not replenishing them quick enough. And this can cause athletes to feel fatigued, feel like they just can't go on, be very tired, have reduced muscle function. And so it's very important to athletes to fuel their workouts when they are going for long workouts or workouts that could be depleting their glycogen stores. It is possible to increase our capacity to store glycogen, and this is possible by training and in endurance athletes. So training can help us increase glycogen stores. It can help improve the ability of our muscles to use fat as fuel. It can help our muscles use branched chain amino acids as fuel. And training can actually increase the number of mitochondria, which are our little energy factories. So training is very efficient. This is just a table from your book, and it's looking at what type of fuel source is used compared to what activity. So red is fat and yellow is carbohydrate. And you can see on the left side of this, we have walking, which would be considered low intensity activity. So during low intensity activity, you're going to be using fat. And remember, when you use fat, you can produce energy for quite a while, but that energy is produced pretty slowly. But that's okay because you're only walking. You don't need that ATP to be regenerated that quickly. As intensity level goes up of your activity, you rely less on fat and more on carbohydrates. And the reason for this is because carbohydrates can provide you with fast ATP. So they can get ATP to you very quickly. And you rely less on fats because fatty acid oxidation is a pretty slow way to get ATP, even though it's efficient. Okay, so talking a little bit more about fats. You saw in the previous table that when the person was walking, doing a low intensity activity, they were predominantly using fats. And fats are a really good fuel source for us because generally speaking, we have plenty of them. We store a lot of them, and they're a very concentrated source of energy. Fat can supply more than twice the ATP as carbohydrate does. However, it's kind of a slow process. So that's only very helpful when we are relying on this for kind of lower intensity activities. When our intensity level is very high, so such as sprinting or powerlifting, our muscles can't use much fat. And that's because some of the steps involved in fat breakdown don't occur fast enough to meet the muscle's demand for ATP in this intense exercise. Fat becomes more important as the energy intensity decreases, like I've already said, and in kind of endurance events. So this is just another way to look at that table that I just showed you with the different activities and what is being used. So the lower the activity level, the more fat that will be used. The higher the activity level, the more carb will be used. And that's because fat breakdown to ADP is kind of slow, where carb conversion to ADP is very quick, and you need quick ATP when you're doing intense activity. Okay, what about using proteins for fuel? So proteins can be used for energy, but they have a pretty small contribution compared to fats or carbs. And our body doesn't really want to use proteins for energy, but we can. The form of proteins that we can use for energy are the branched chain amino acids, and they can be used to make glucose or enter the citric acid cycle. And we only get about 5% of our energy needs from amino acids, except in the circumstances of endurance events where you have depleted your glycogen and begun to, tap into your fat stores. Protein is used the least in resistance exercise. And so I have another chart coming up on my next page. So again, here you see fat is used more as the intensity of the activity is low. You've got lots of fat being used here. As the intensity gets higher, you use more carbs, and very rarely do you ever use a lot of proteins. However, if this slide said endurance, meaning time, you might have a slight increase in proteins used. This is another chart. So we're looking at lots and lots of charts, intensity versus what is used. This is talking about intensity in something called VO2 max, which you can read about in your book, but this has to do with oxygen consumption during activity. And when you're doing high intensity sports, you are going to be using a lot of oxygen. You're going to be breathing very quickly. When you're doing low intensity sports like walking, you're not breathing that quickly, so you're not using that much oxygen. And so you can see that at low intensity, you are primarily using fats. At very high intensity, you are using glycogen as your main fuel source. And then kind of moderate, you have kind of a mixed bag where you're using a little bit of everything. This is a summary table that looks at the three systems that we talked about and discusses differences between them. So this would be a good table to kind of commit to memory. And so remember, creatine phosphate will last about 5 to 10 seconds, anaerobic glycolysis about 30 to 120, and oxidative phosphorylation, remember that is aerobic, will last 2 minutes to 3 hours. ATP you don't even see on here because it doesn't really count since it only gives us like 1 to 2 seconds of energy. All right, so what should we eat to help fuel our activities? That is a very good question that athletes often want to know about. And I will tell you my version of this will be shorter than the information that's out there. We could spend an entire quarter talking about this, but we don't have an entire quarter. So we'll give you just some general rules of thumb. So energy needs will vary based on many things, and I actually don't think that this is a complete list of things that can cause variations in energy expenditure. For example, this lists the sport you're doing and your gender. I would also argue that your energy needs will change on your body composition, your age, your expected energy expenditure, the time of that event, etc. If you are trying to lose weight, you are going to want to decrease your calories by 200 to 500 a day. If you are trying to gain weight, you would want to increase your calories by 500 to 700 a day. So I know a lot of bodybuilders want to gain weight, and they want to specifically gain weight as muscle, but they need more calories to be able to do that. Also, sometimes bodybuilders want to lose weight. They usually want to lose weight as fat. And so reducing their calories could be a strategy for that. Okay, what are carb recommendations for different workout intensities? Because we use more fat at low to moderate intensity, we need less carbs. So if you're just walking down the street or going out for a walk downtown, you probably don't need to be eating, energy gels and Gatorade and sucrose beverages because your body is able to use fat. However, if you are increasing the duration of that workout and increasing the intensity, you may need to use more carbohydrates because in those circumstances, your body is going to be relying a little bit less on fat, and your glycogen will become very depleted. Boosting glycogen stores. So I mentioned already that an athlete could boost their glycogen stores by training. And one of the methods that people use is staggering their training and their carbohydrate intake to peak during a competition. So you would start this approximately a week before the competition, and as you get closer to the competition, you're going to reduce your exercise time, meaning your energy expended, and you're going to increase your carb intake. And the point of this is to increase your glycogen stores. This is called carb loading. I'm sure you guys have heard of it. These are why people go have spaghetti dinners, the night before a race. But this can increase your glycogen stored by 50 to 85% over normal. And that can increase that quick energy that's available to your muscles. The only downside of this is that glycogen stores, as they increase, your body does hold on to water tighter, and so this can cause heavier muscles. This is a diagram of glycogen over time, and so you can see that in the beginning, this person has plenty of glycogen. However, over time, their glycogen is significantly depleted. This is another graph of glycogen over time. This time frame is a lot longer. It's 72 hours, and that's 3 days. So on each of these 3 days, this person was running 16 kilometers. And as they ran, their glycogen stores were very, very depleted. However, if they ate a high carb diet, they were able to bring their glycogen stores back up slightly overnight so that they had some the next day. Glycogen dropped again, they could bring it up, drop again, bring it up. So when they ate the high carbs, they were able to replenish their glycogen quicker than when they ate a low carb diet. And so if you are an athlete who has to perform multiple days in a row, eating a high carb diet would be very beneficial to replenishing your glycogen stores. Okay, fat and protein recommendations. So what should we eat? So fat, usually the intakes are very similar to non-athletes, so 15 to 25%. And what types of fat should we eat? We should try to eat healthy fats. So monounsaturated fats, polyunsaturated fats. We should try to not eat trans fats or fats in processed foods and try to potentially limit saturated fats. Protein needs of athletes can be pretty high depending on the type of activity and that person's body composition. And the idea of this higher need protein for athletes is because, one, athletes may be using some of their protein as energy. They will need more protein to repair damaged muscles, and they're going to need more protein to synthesize new muscles. If you intake too much protein, more than what you need, so more than above this range, it is not necessarily that helpful. And so it can lead to increased urine production, which could dehydrate an athlete and be bad. And some of those amino acids that you intake will be used for energy. It can also decrease your carb intake, because often people who follow high protein diets do eat low carbohydrates. And remember, we just looked at the importance of carbohydrate as an energy source. And so if you were not eating enough carbohydrate, that could potentially reduce your performance. Vitamin and mineral recommendations. So there's a lot of thought that there should be different DRIs for athletes. However, there are not any established yet because we need more evidence. It is thought that athletes may especially need more of the B vitamins because the B vitamins are needed for energy metabolism and red blood cell health. And athletes are having very, very high rates of metabolism and ATP synthesis, and so those B vitamins are essential to that process. Athletes may also need more iron, especially female athletes, because female athletes are menstruating. Vegans and vegetarians may not be getting significant iron in their diet if they're not thinking about their diet properly. Distance athletes and intense workouts may need more iron. And this is a consideration that shouldn't even be in the same category. But if somebody appears to be anemic, you should rule out a sports anemia due to increased plasma volume. So in athletes, they do have increased plasma volume, and the blood plasma volume expands as they begin to train. However, the expansion in plasma volume precedes, meaning comes before, our body is able to synthesize enough red blood cells. And so for a while, somebody can appear anemic because their high blood plasma volume is kind of having a dilutional effect on their red blood cells. This can cause blood iron levels to look low. And so you would want to rule that out before you decided somebody was truly iron deficient. But many athletes are iron deficient, and I myself, when I used to run many endurance events, I was iron deficient. I did have anemia, and I had to take over-the-counter iron supplements as well as get iron injections. And I ate very healthy. I ate, leafy greens. I ate vegetable sources of irons, but I also ate meat and I ate animal sources of iron, and I was eating plenty of calories. I wasn't losing weight or anything. And so it had to do with my athleticism alone. Another thing that can happen, especially in runners, is very scientific term, but they call it foot slap anemia. And in runners, they can actually lyse or burst some of the red blood cells from the actual impact of running, and that can lead to anemia as well. Female athlete triad. So this kind of overlaps into the area of eating disorders, but it's not officially recognized as one. This has actually been changed recently to also include males, because this can include males. However, our book still has it as female athlete triad. So female athlete triad usually happens in female athletes, like it sounds, and female athletes are prone to potentially not eating enough or disordered eating, meaning they are purposely not eating as many calories as they need because they want to maintain a certain body type or a certain body image. And this is common of athletes of all types: rock climbers, gymnasts, dancers, runners, all types of athletes. But it is especially worse in females because as they suffer these energy deficits, it can affect their hormone levels and they can actually stop menstruating. And that can be very negative to them. It can also affect blood calcium levels or bone calcium levels, and calcium can be pulled from the bone. And so this can lead to low peak bone mass over time. And so this female athlete triad is something that coaches and family members and teammates should look out for. Fluid recommendations. So losing too much fluid is very dangerous. They actually recommend that serious athletes should weigh themselves pre and post workout, and they should weigh themselves without clothing so that they can determine how much fluid was lost by sweating. If you weigh yourself without clothing, when you take your clothing off after workout, that sweat has probably absorbed into the clothing. And I actually have tried doing this about 5 years ago when I was training for a pretty big event. I actually practiced this to see how much fluid I was losing, and the amount was remarkable. I was living in the Central Valley then, which is very, very hot, but I would try to run in the mornings when it wasn't that hot, but I was losing a liter and a half with each training session. So it just was a good reminder that I really, really needed to be conscious on what I was drinking. If you lose 2% of this body weight through fluids, it's going to lead to reductions in your endurance, reductions in your strength, reductions in your overall performance. It's also going to potentially lead to reductions in your blood volume and reductions in your ability to regulate your internal temperature, which could cause you to get too hot, or potentially too cold, but usually too hot. And the reason too hot is because we use fluids to sweat, and as that sweat evaporates, it helps cool us down. But if we don't have enough fluids, our sweat production will be reduced, and we cannot maintain our internal temperature. So yeah, I just mentioned weighing in. If you have weighed in and you lose 1 pound of body weight, you need to replace that by 3 cups of water. If you can't monitor your weight change, look at your urine. So is it, light yellow? Or is it clear? Or is it kind of dark orange or brownish color? That would be an indication that you're dehydrated. By the time you feel thirsty, it is often too late. This is considered a late sign of dehydration. And so if you only drink when you are thirsty, it could take up to 48 hours to replenish your fluid needs. So, what should you do before an event? You should drink 5 to 7 mils of fluid per kilogram of your body weight about 4 hours before an event. During the event, you should drink fluid to prevent dehydration. And after the event, 2 to 3 cups of fluid per pound of body weight lost. And this is, of course, individualized because some people sweat more, some people lose more fluid than others, some people don't sweat as much, and then it will vary depending on the intensity of the activity. What should you drink? Or what should you not drink? Can you drink too much? The answer is yes. So it is possible to overhydrate. And generally speaking, overhydration happens when an athlete is drinking water, but they're not getting any electrolytes. And so they're not replacing sodium. And we do lose sodium in our sweat. Our sweat is very salty. And so if we are just drinking water, but we're losing sodium, the sodium in our bloodstream gets even more diluted. And this can lead to imbalances, and sodium is key to cell function. And so this could actually lead to death. It's important to prevent this by drinking fluids, yes, but if you're sweating a lot, drinking a fluid with some electrolytes in it, like some of these sports drinks here, or some athletes like to supplement. There are literally salt tabs you can take. I've known athletes who take small packets of salt, like that you would find in a restaurant, and use those while they're working out. And so whatever works for you is okay. But if you are doing a long activity where you are sweating a lot, it is recommended that you do not only drink water, you need to also replenish your electrolytes. So sports drinks for events that are long, like I said, over an hour. And the value of sports drinks for replenishing body fluids is actually very well documented. Sports drinks should be given to athletes when those athletes are being active and when those athletes are sweating. People who do not need sports drinks are people who are sedentary and not active and not sweating. There is no benefit for somebody who is sedentary to have a sports drink like Gatorade. And there is probably harm because it contains sugar and that person will gain weight if they're just sedentary. I once sat in a conference that was a half-day conference, so about 4 hours, and sitting across from me was a middle-aged woman, visibly overweight, who had 3 large Gatorades on her desk that she drank during the conference. And it was interesting because Gatorade is a sports drink, and I knew she wasn't sweating or losing electrolytes. And I didn't want her to judge her for drinking the Gatorades. It was definitely better than drinking soda, but it was also higher calories than drinking water, so maybe try substituting with water if you're not being active. But Gatorade literally was designed for the Florida Gators, a football team in Florida. Florida is very hot, very humid. The football players were practicing in intense heat, sweating a lot, losing a lot of electrolytes, and this drink was designed to improve their performance, which it did. And then now we have all sorts of spin-offs of it. But these drinks actually are pretty healthful. Sports drinks are different than energy drinks. Energy drinks often have other ingredients like caffeine, added sugars, added special ingredients, even sometimes alcohol. And many energy drinks, I'm talking like Red Bull, Rockstar, Monster, things like that. Many energy drinks are carbonated. That can lead to indigestion. And so generally speaking, energy drinks should be avoided. However, sports drinks are good. If you are working out for over 60 minutes, sports drinks are good. Less than 60 minutes, water is probably just fine. Sports drinks also have low amounts of sugar that is in an easy form for our body to absorb, where energy drinks have too high sugar. What about food? So, what kind of food should we eat before and during and after exercise? The purpose of eating before, during, and after exercise is to maximize our glycogen stores before we start activity, replace our glycogen stores during activity, and then after activity, replace those glycogen stores, prevent hunger, provide fluid, and provide protein for muscle repair and new muscle synthesis. So eating adequately at all those times is very important. Your eating plan for exercise should start with pre-exercise meal, and this will prevent you from getting hungry. It will also help ensure that you have adequate glycogen levels. It is recommended to try to eat this about 3 to 4 hours before you're going to have an event or workout. But if you eat it shortly before, you should eat a little bit less. So, for example, if you can eat 4 hours before, you can have 4 grams of carbohydrate per kilo. But if you only eat 1 hour before, you should only have 1 gram of carbohydrate per kilo. Fat should be relatively low because sometimes fat causes digestion issues while people are being physically athletic or being physically active. And then this food should be non-gas producing because who wants gas while they are trying to perform at their best? That could just cause pain and discomfort, reduce physical performance, and readily digestible. You don't want your body to have to work too hard to break down a lot of fiber or break down a really complex protein. You want to give it easy carbs, orange juice, milk, honey, really easy things to eat, some fruits, smoothies, things like that. During exercise, so events that are over 1 hour, you should try to consume carbs. Carbs are CHO, about 30 to 60 grams per hour. And some popular choices are sports drinks, carb gels like Goo, or I don't know what the other ones are called, Power Gel, and then energy bars are pretty popular choices. And the point of this will be to maximize your performance during that event and then avoid that kind of bonking or hitting the wall when your glycogen could be depleted. Some studies and some research is looking at combination sources of carbohydrate to maximize this. And so looking at foods or drinks that might have glucose, fructose, and other types of carbohydrates. And the idea with that is that they would be absorbed through different routes. And so overall, the absorption potentially would be higher. After your workout, so we want to replace glycogen and promote protein synthesis and protein repair if needed. You do want to consume carbs very quickly following a workout. And this is because following a workout or following exercise, your glycogen synthesis rate is the highest that it ever is. And so you're more able to store glucose as glycogen. Also, the cells are very insulin sensitive, so they can take up glucose very easily. You do want to eat foods that are easy to digest and that have a high glycemic load. And so foods with a high glycemic load will be absorbed very quickly and sugar will be delivered to the bloodstream very quickly. So examples of that are like juice, bread, white rice, sports drinks, etc. Protein you also want to consume pretty shortly after finishing activity, and protein can help with muscle repair and delayed muscle damage. If you're not going to be active again for a couple days, it's not as crucial that you eat carbs directly after. But if you are planning to be active again shortly, you should try to follow your physical activity with a carb meal. These are some example post-exercise meals, and you can see these are at different calorie levels. So this would depend on how long or how intense your workout was, which calorie level would be best for you. All right, last but not least, so ergonomic aids. Again, I'm not covering this in much detail, but if you want to learn more about it, you can read about it in your book. But ergonomic aids are substances that are intended to improve exercise performance. And some ergonomic aids actually work, but I would say many ergonomic aids out there on the market potentially do not work or are potentially harmful. And so our book has some really good charts on which ones may work and which ones um, don't work, or which ones work in certain situations, and you can read about that. All right, so multiple choice. So, which pathway produces the most ATP? Is it creatine, oxidative phosphorylation, anaerobic glycolysis? Hopefully you said B. How many energy systems are there? Again, B. Next midterm. So the next midterm is proteins through sports nutrition, and it will have questions on eating disorders. If you are listening to this in an online class, obviously you do not need your Scantron to come take the online test if you're taking the test online. Okay, thanks for listening. Again, I know this was shorter, but I encourage you to read more about it in your book if you're interested. Thank you. Bye.